In our last video, we discussed why Japan didn't conquer Hawaii after being so successful in the attack on Pearl Harbor. But what if Japan had tried to conquer Hawaii? How would that story have unfolded? Shall we satisfy that curiosity? Counterfactual history, or alternative history, is not guesswork, nor is it mere fiction. It is an exercise based on real conditions, the resources available to the players of the time, and the possible choices. It's not about imagining just anything, but about exploring plausible scenarios within the material and political limits of that moment. When talking about a possible Japanese invasion of Hawaii in 1941, it's necessary to respect those limits. Japan couldn't suddenly create hundreds of transport ships that it didn't have, but we can imagine that if it had redirected resources from other operations, it might have tried to assemble something close to an invasion force. To land on Oahu, which is the main island of Hawaii, Japan would have to mobilize at least between 100 and 150,000 soldiers. This force would be equivalent to 4 or 5 full infantry divisions, with infantry units, artillery, light armored vehicles, engineering, and also logistics. The embarkation of these troops would require between 200 and 300 transport ships, in addition to additional escorts. The covering force couldn't be just the Kido Butai. It would be necessary to add at least 6 to 8 battleships to carry out the coastal bombardment of the invasion area, in addition to having more cruisers and destroyers to protect the convoys. The risk of an American counterattack would be constant, requiring the Japanese to maintain constant vigilance. The element of surprise that worked in the air attack would hardly be repeated in an amphibious operation. Moving hundreds of ships across thousands of kilometers of ocean would hardly go unnoticed. Let's suppose that despite the difficulties, the Japanese fleet managed to approach Oahu in a position to launch a landing. The island's beaches, especially Waikiki and other flatter areas, would be the most likely points for the action. The landing would resemble on a smaller scale the future invasion of Normandy. Japanese troops in improvised barges would advance toward the sand under fire from American coastal artillery. Browning machine guns, 5-inch guns, and anti-aircraft guns adapted for ground fire would defend those approaches. Japanese tanks such as the Type 95 Heigo, which was a light tank with a 37mm gun, and also the Type 97 Chiha, which was a medium tank with a 57mm gun, would be landed to support the infantry. However, these machines were quite vulnerable against American anti-tank weapons and would have a lot of difficulty in the rough terrain of that island. The initial battle would certainly be bloody. The Japanese could capture the beachheads, but with a very high number of casualties. The number of casualties in the first 48 hours could be comparable to operations like Guadalcanal or even Normandy, because without the Allied logistical advantage, we can expect that the Japanese would suffer a lot. If they managed to advance beyond the beaches, the Japanese would face urban battles, and in elevated terrain, Honolulu and other populated areas would serve as strongholds for the Americans. The geography of Oahu clearly favored the defender. The island's roads were very narrow, with mountain ranges and forested areas on both sides of the road, which made mechanized advancement very difficult. The American garrison, although surprised, would have the morale to fight to the end. The shock of the air attack would turn into stubborn resistance from the troops, and these soldiers could fall back to prepare defensive positions and prolong the fighting, which was already quite costly for the Japanese. It is also plausible to assume that, after days of battle, the Japanese could manage to occupy parts of the island, including the Pearl Harbor naval base. But victory, up to that point, would be partial and costly. Conquering Hawaii would be just the first step. Holding Hawaii would be the real challenge. To control Oahu, Japan would need to leave a minimum garrison of 40 to 50,000 soldiers. This force would have to watch over a population of approximately 400,000 people, which was the population of Hawaii in 1941, in addition to managing American prisoners of war, which would amount to about 50,000 men. Besides the infantry, an air force would be needed on the island, with 200 to 300 Zero fighters for air defense and also 100 medium bombers for ocean patrol. The captured runways at Hickenfield and Willerfield could be used, but they would require repairs and a constant supply of fuel and parts. At sea, it would be essential to keep at least 1 or 2 aircraft carriers nearby, as well as cruisers and destroyers to protect the approaches to the island. Submarines based at Pearl Harbor could reinforce this defensive setup. But let's remember that all of this depends on fuel and parts. Here lies the fatal point of this whole scenario: logistics, because Japan is located 6,500 kilometers from Hawaii. And maintaining those 50,000 men, hundreds of planes, and a fleet in place would require monthly convoys with dozens of ships loaded with supplies. These convoys would cross an ocean that would quickly become a terribly hostile territory for the Japanese, because the American submarines, still few in number, in 1941 would increase in number and efficiency very quickly throughout 1942. Over time, the Japan-Hawaii route would turn into a corridor of destruction. In addition, the fuel needed for the Japanese fleet to protect these convoys would be immense. And here we also find a contradiction. Japan actually needed to conquer Southeast Asia to secure its oil supply and divert resources to invade Hawaii. It would mean putting at risk the very reason for the war. Even if Japan conquered Oahu, the United States would react with unprecedented fury. Occupying American territory would be viewed as a direct threat to the continent. Industrial mobilization, already immense after the air attack, would be even more accelerated in this alternate scenario. Between 1942 and 1943, the United States launched dozens of new Essex-class aircraft carriers, hundreds of destroyers and submarines, as well as thousands of aircraft. A Japanese garrison in Hawaii would be doomed to isolation from the very first day, bombarded and eventually obliterated. Long-range bombers could reach Oahu by flying directly from California. The American Navy, reinforced by industry, would organize an inevitable counteroffensive. Even in an alternate scenario in which Japan conquered Oahu, the predictable outcome for this entire endeavor would be a strategic disaster. The garrison would be isolated without adequate supplies and would eventually be annihilated by American forces far superior to them. The initial effort would have cost hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of lives, in addition to diverting resources from the crucial campaigns in Southeast Asia. Instead of prolonging the war, this invasion could shorten the war, hastening Japan's final defeat. The exercise of imagining the invasion shows the importance of logistics in war. Japan could be bold, could deliver brilliant tactical blows, but it couldn't escape material and geographical limitations. An operation of this magnitude would require not only courage, but also an industrial and naval base that simply didn't exist in Japan in 1941. The option taken by Isoroku Yamamoto, that is, to attack from the air, destroy ships and planes, and buy time for Japan, was the greatest boldness possible under those circumstances. Going beyond that would be literally attempting the impossible, but let's imagine the scenario here. After the air attack on December 7, 1941, Japan not only bombards Pearl Harbor, but also manages to land troops, defeat the American garrison, and occupy Oahu. The rising sun flag would fly over the naval base, and the psychological shock in the United States would be incalculable. For the United States to lose an island in the middle of the Pacific, and not just any island, but Hawaii, right, a vital link between the continental United States and Asia, would be interpreted as an existential threat. Pearl Harbor would no longer be just a day of infamy. It would become a national humiliation. The political and social reaction would be immediate, total mobilization, unprecedented. Franklin Roosevelt, in his historic speech on December 8th, would have even more arguments to convince Congress and the public. The narrative would not only be one of betrayal, but of territorial invasion. In this scenario, even the most isolationist sectors of the United States would have been swept away by a wave of indignation. The great American advantage was its industry. In 1941, the United States was already the largest industrial producer in the world. The mobilization program, which began timidly in 1940, was accelerated after Pearl Harbor. In historical reality, between 1941 and 1945, the United States, with its enormous industry, produced 88 aircraft carriers, 24 of which were the large Essex-class carriers, no less than 349 escort destroyers, 203 submarines, and, believe it or not, 300,000 aircraft, as well as 2.4 million military vehicles. With the Japanese occupation of Hawaii, these numbers could have been even higher, as the sense of urgency would have intensified. The government would have expanded programs like the Victory Program even more rapidly, already underway, prioritizing the Pacific even before Europe. One of the first instruments of the American response would be submarine warfare. Even in 1941, the United States already had a fairly considerable submarine force, based mainly in Manila, Pearl Harbor, and the west coast of the United States. Although they faced technical problems with torpedoes at the beginning of the war, American submarines soon became formidable weapons. If Japan occupied Hawaii, the supply convoys between Yokohama and Honolulu would become priority targets. The long lines of communication stretching across thousands of kilometers of ocean would be very vulnerable. Over time, American industry would deploy dozens of new submarines, turning the route into a death corridor for Japanese shipping. In the real war, American aircraft carriers took center stage after the temporary loss of the battleships. Battles like the Coral Sea and also Midway showed the effectiveness of American carrier-based air power. With Hawaii in Japanese hands, the need to retake the archipelago would accelerate the production and deployment of the new Essex-class aircraft carriers. By 1943, dozens of these units would be ready to form powerful task forces. Each group would have hundreds of aircraft capable of launching massive attacks against naval and land targets. Occupied Hawaii would become the #1 target of these forces. Systematic air bombing, similar to what we saw that devastated Rabaul or Truk Lagoon, would reduce the Japanese positions to ruins even before a counter-invasion. Another factor to consider is American long-range aviation. In 1941, the United States was already developing the B-29 Superfortress bomber, with enough range to fly from California to Hawaii. Although this aircraft only entered service in 1944, earlier models, like the B-24 Liberator, could be adapted for missions against Oahu. Thus, even in 1942 and 1943, the Japanese garrison in Hawaii could be the target of direct attacks coming from the American mainland. The combination of aerial bombings and naval attacks would turn the island into a true constant battlefield. The American logic would be clear and unmistakable. First isolate, then bomb, and finally reconquer. This formula was applied on several Pacific islands such as Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. With Hawaii, the scale would be larger, but the principle would remain the same. The isolated Japanese would have increasing difficulties receiving supplies. Hunger, lack of fuel, and shortage of ammunition would erode their ability to resist. The defenses would gradually be neutralized by air attacks and naval bombardments. And the final step would be the anticipated American counter-invasion. Once air and naval superiority was established, the United States would land its immense reconquest force. If we compare it to the Okinawa operation in 1945, we can even use it as a reference. There, 1,500 ships were used, transporting 180,000 soldiers who landed against 100,000 Japanese defenders. The battle lasted almost 3 months and cost tens of thousands of lives. In the case of Hawaii, the numbers would be similar or even higher because the United States would spare no effort to recover a piece of its own territory. A force of between 200 and 250,000 soldiers could be mobilized, supported by thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ships. Faced with this overwhelming force, the Japanese garrison, no matter how determined, would not be able to resist. It's important to emphasize that the effect the loss of Hawaii would have on American public opinion would be immense. Pearl Harbor, the real event, already caused deep indignation, but an occupation of enemy territory would have caused an even greater shock, comparable to an invasion of the mainland itself. And the government would use that sentiment to justify not only total war, but also harsher measures of economic and social mobilization. Mass recruitment, rationing, the conversion of civilian industry to military, all of that would have been much more accelerated. The entire country would move in unison, determined to retake Hawaii at any cost. And, in the midst of all that, an additional element to consider is the global context. In 1941, the Soviet Union was already facing the German invasion, and Great Britain was resisting Germany in Europe and also in the Middle East. Both allies would see the Japanese occupation of Hawaii as a sign of the conflict worsening. It's plausible that greater cooperation would have been established even earlier among the three powers. Lend-lease to the Soviet Union and to China could have been expanded much more rapidly. The focus on defeating Japan could have taken priority even over Germany, at least temporarily. Regardless of the details, the predictable outcome would be the defeat of Japan. Over time, the balance of resources would become overwhelming. In 1942, the United States was already producing more aircraft than Japan could keep up with in its wildest dreams. In 1943, that difference became abysmal. Japan, limited in resources and dependent on imports, would have no way to sustain a garrison in Hawaii. Even if they managed to prolong their resistance for months or even years, the outcome would always be the same: isolation, attrition, and destruction. If Japan had occupied Hawaii in 1941, the United States would have responded with a full mobilization. Industry would have been prioritized for the Pacific. Submarines, aircraft carriers, and bombers would have isolated the Japanese garrison, and a massive counter-invasion, supported by relentless bombing, would have retaken Oahu within a few years. The cost in lives would be extremely high, but the outcome would also be inevitable. Far from guaranteeing victory for Japan, the occupation of Hawaii would only have hastened its defeat, accelerating American involvement and turning the island into a Stalingrad of the Pacific, even greater than the actual Battle of Manila. Share this video with your friends. Subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything else, and I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from the War Room.